Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our penultimate Black History Month event. I know this will be a real treat for all of you and myself. I have not seen the film. How many of you have seen it? Dang! I'm like the last brother in the city who has not seen the film. But from what I've heard, there are no spoiler alerts, but you guys don't need it anyway. But thank you so much for coming. I just want to remind you, again, my name is Milleri Pauline. I am the Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs here at NYU Gallatin. Thank you for coming. Wanted to remind you that we have one more event for Black History Month, Coding While Black, Artificial Intelligence, Computing and Data in a Racialized World. And that will happen on Monday, February 26th from 6:30 to 8. We've had a number of wonderful events this past month, and I'm so glad that it's been really a tremendous support of all the events. So thank you, and thank you to all of you who spread the word and have come and supported our efforts here to celebrate history and culture and life of Black folks in the diaspora. We will have Osvaldo Oyola, who will come and introduce and talk a little bit and give a little bit of a background and also introduce Jonathan Gray. I will introduce Osvaldo. Jonathan will come up after Osvaldo introduces him, and then they will have a conversation between them, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. Professor Osvaldo Oyola has taught composition and expository writing since 2008 and received his doctorate from Binghamton University, where he focused on contemporary transnational American literature with a particular interest in the intersection of pop culture and racial and gender identity and immigrant and migrant narratives. He regularly writes about comics and music on his blog, The Middle Spaces. Would you welcome Osvaldo?
Well, that light is bright. All right. I'm going to try to keep my introductory comments brief so we can get to the main event. It's my honor to introduce Jonathan W. Gray, Associate Professor of English at John Jay College and CUNY, at the CUNY Graduate Center, founding editor of the Journal of Comics and Culture, author of Civil Rights in the White Literary Imagination, and co-editor of Disability in Comics and Graphic Novels. Jonathan's current book project is Illustrating the Race, Representing Blackness in American Comics for Columbia University Press, which traces depictions of African Americans in comics from 1966 to the present. He's published academic articles on modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, Cal Baker's graphic novel Nat Turner, and Jay-Z's relationship to Black masculinity. His journalism on comics and popular culture has appeared in places like EntertainmentWeekly.com, Salon, and The New Inquiry. I got to know Jonathan through our mutual love of superhero comic books and our critical attention to them in terms of their representation of race and other intersecting identities. And I can say without exaggeration that his brilliance is only matched by his collegiality. For real. He's here tonight to talk about Black Panther and the evolution of blackness in superhero comics. There's been a lot of people talking and writing about Black Panther lately. So many think pieces and tweet storms in the last week that I'm actually a little overwhelmed and feeling way behind, and people keep citing something that someone posted. I'm like, I haven't read that yet. And that's only part of the Black Panther phenomenon. We've witnessed in the last week the film shattering box office records, viral videos of joyous Black people arriving at the theater in costume, taking group photos in front of movie posters and cardboard displays. In the case of one friend of mine, he arrived with his whole family and enough jollof rice to share with everyone in his row at the movie theater. For real, there's video evidence. This reaction is simultaneously a continuation of a tradition of Black pride and seeing oneself reflected in popular narratives of the day, and an opportunity for a new beginning in making those transmedial representations as diverse, layered, and complex as the people themselves. Black superheroes are finally getting their due, in part because of scholars like Jonathan Gray examining the potentials and limits of these characters, the meanings of their shortfalls, stereotypes, successes, obstacles, and swagger, the political context from which they emerge, and the transnational utopic futures that they imagine and embody. Jonathan's work is crucial for identifying visions to challenge and support, not only in the rarefied air of canonized literary work, but in the everyday mass culture with which people are engaged, that they imagine through, and by which we consider the ethics of everyday political actions. His work seeks to disrupt and decenter and re-network narratives in ways that force us to reconsider the power of illustration, not only in the literal graphic sense, but in the act of bringing ideas to light for critical consideration. For better or worse, for the last 15 years, we've been in the era of superhero films and more recently superhero TV shows like Black Lightning and Luke Cage. And in that light, Black Panther was a long time coming. How long did we have to wait between Wesley Snipes' Blade and the current moment? A long time. And historicizing this cultural phenomenon is a necessary condition for making the most of it, not just a flash in the pan to line the pockets of white-dominated Hollywood, but an opportunity to embrace it with the unbridled joy of the fan and the critical rigor that keeps pushing for more. Not just more representation, but what that can buy in a political economy based on images evolving within a multimodal, media-rich environment. Dr. Jonathan M. Gray is a scholar whose work is a crucial part of that arc, and we're privileged today to have a chance to hear his brilliant approach. Guests and esteemed colleagues, Dr. Jonathan Gray.
I'm not sure who he was talking about, but wow, that was quite outstanding. So this is incongruous. Imagine if several months ago someone asked you to talk about physics, and then the week before you're due to talk, Einstein's theory of relativity comes out, right? It's just like, oh God, nothing I say really matters now, right? So I've been working on this talk for some time, and the bulk of it, like 95% of it, was written before I saw the movie. And so because of that, while we are going to, during the Q&A, get into what it means, this is mostly a talk about comics, about the text, about the things that everything emerges from. But before we begin, I have to give thanks. I want to thank Millery Paulinet for inviting me here, the Gallatin School for furnishing this space, and Rachel Polzer for bringing it all together. I want to thank Osvaldo for that more than generous introduction and for being a wonderful interlocutor and a friend. I want to thank Jack Kirby and Stan Lee for creating this character all those years ago. Also thank Don McGregor, Christopher Priest, Reggie Hudlin, and Ta-Nehisi Coates for building out the world of Wakanda. And more recently, thank Ryan Coogler and Chadwick Boseman for bringing him, the man and his world, so dramatically to cinematic life. This seemed so much simpler back then, and back then was like a week ago before the film came out. But all I can do now is press on with what I have to offer, even as my ideas have been taken over, or rather overtaken, by recent events. But the only way to do this is to start at the beginning, and so. This is the talk, that's me, that's Twitter, I'm there all the time. As Jelani Cobb notes in his review of Coogler's Black Panther in The New Yorker, quote, Africa is a creation of a white world and the literary, academic, cinematic, and political mechanisms that it used to give that mythology the credibility of truth. No such nation as Wakanda exists on the map of the continent, but that is entirely beside the point. Wakanda is no more or less imaginary than the Africa canonized in such Hollywood offerings as Tarzan. close quote. Given this reality, it is perhaps fitting that the Black Panther owes his existence to two Jewish American creators, artist Jack Kirby and the writer Stan Lee. While the tradition in comics is to list the writer first, I deliberately invert this arrangement, not because I've taken a side in the contentious debate over which of these legendary creators deserves more credit for realizing the Marvel Universe, but because I think that Kirby's political vision is key to understanding the initial iteration of Wakanda. While both Lee and Kirby are Jewish, Lee's assimilationist ethos produces everyman characters like Peter Parker and Scott Summers. Kirby's heroes, particularly those he created on his own or with other collaborators other than Stan Lee, often embodied a resistance to the violence of totalizing state power. And this is Kirby's creation with a writer named Joe Simon. And a couple of quick things here. Anytime people tell you that comics are getting too political, just this comic was produced 6 months before Pearl Harbor. So we were not in the war when Captain America #1 came out, and on the cover of Captain America #1, he's punching Hitler, right? So this is a forward-thinking political act, and also it's really, really, really important to punch Nazis. Just so we're clear. This difference is in part the difference between someone like Peter Parker and someone like Captain America. This difference is in part the result of Kirby's visceral disdain for injustice, a sentiment deepened, and here's another one of his characters, who fights not just for America, but now he fights for Earth, right? So this difference is deepened by Kirby's experience in the European theater during World War II. The difference between Lee and Kirby's artistic approaches, then, isn't generational so much as it is experiential. Kirby served, while Lee did not. Given this, I think that when Lee presented Kirby with the idea of the Fantastic Four encountering an African superhero, Kirby jumped at the chance to offer up a vision that anticipates the Afrofuturism that has come to define both the Black Panther's visual aesthetic and people of African descent's engagement with the worlds of science fiction and fantasy. By offering a techno-futuristic revision of Africa through the first prominent character of African descent created in the modern comic industry, Black Panther's debut in Fantastic Four 52 marks an important milestone for representation of people of color in comics, there's the cover, not simply due to the novelty of his ethnicity. Because he's a hero, the Black Panther demands from his audience the same sort of sympathetic identification extended to Captain America or Batman. This not only provides an opportunity for a white audience to align their sympathies with a Black character, it offers a corrective for African and African American audiences bereft of heroic representation. This would have far-reaching consequences. For, as Frantz Fanon notes in Black Skin, White Masks, quote, in the comic books, the wolf, the devil, the evil spirit, the bad man, the savage are always symbolized by Negroes or Indians. Since there is always identification with the victor, the little Negro, quite as easily as the little white boy, becomes an explorer, an adventurer, a missionary who faces the danger of being eaten by the wicked Negroes. And here I'm just gonna, ask you to think about M'Baku, right? Who says, just kidding, we're vegetarian, right? Fanon was writing about the comics he encountered in his youth in Martinique, a Francophone Caribbean colony where he undoubtedly encountered not only the French translation of Tarzan, but also the misadventures of Tintin. While this talk will not trace the psychological effects of coming of age in a society with the proliferation of these kinds of images, it takes seriously Fanon's contention that representing an African as a heroic figure creates transformative possibilities because it offers to previously excluded groups an intimate connection to cultural narratives that underpin much of what follows. With the Black Panther, Lee and Kirby create what Cameroonian philosopher Achille Bembe might term an autonomous African subject. And by complicating the perfidious stereotypes that were the norm in much of popular culture in 1966, they created an icon whose fictive presence allows audiences and creators who followed to connect T'Challa with a number of past, presents, and futures. Black Panther has been associated with, and this is a partial list, Ethiopian resistance to Italian colonialism in the 1930s, the decolonization movement that swept across the African continent in the 1950s and 60s. The Black Panther Party that coincidentally emerges at almost the same time in 1968, the Afrofuturism represented by figures like Sun Ra and Fela Kuti in the 70s, and the Afrocentricity of the late 1980s and early 1990s that is in part a response to the racist rhetoric of the Reagan and Bush administration. So he's an incredibly flexible figure. He serves so many different purposes. Lee and other writers like Steve Englehart and Roy Thomas did not always recognize these affiliations, and they weren't always comfortable with them when they did, which resulted in uncomfortable incongruities, which we will explore later. Indeed, it wasn't until creators like Magruder, Priest, Hudlin, and Coates, it wasn't until they sought to reconcile Black Panther's fictive African alterity within the Marvel Universe by focusing on the world of Wakanda that T'Challa truly comes into his own. So Black Panther 52, which is this issue, revolves around a device which has become a cliche in the superhero comic, and now in the superhero movies as well. Heroes mistakenly fight each other during their initial encounter, only to belatedly recognize their gallantry and put their differences to the side to confront the true enemy. Fantastic Four 52 puts a different gloss on this convention because T'Challa summons the Fantastic Four to Wakanda with the intention of fighting them once they arrive. The Black Panther lures the group, scientist Reed Richards, pilot Ben Grimm, college student Johnny Storm, and his older sister Susan Richards, to his nation by sending them an advanced airship. Richards marvels at the technological acumen evidenced in the vehicle's construction. And when he reveals that, quote, an African chieftain called the Black Panther sent it, Grimm, Ben Grimm, the Thing, whose anti-intellectual working class persona Lee and Kirby often employ as comic relief, wonders, quote, how a refugee from a Tarzan movie laid his hands on this kind of gizmo. His curiosity piqued, Richards assembles his team, which involves collecting Johnny Storm and, for some reason, his Native American roommate Wyatt Wingfoot from their dorm at the fictional Metro College, which Metro College is NYU. It's just a stand-in for NYU, so Johnny Storm went to NYU, just so you know. So anyway, so they collect Johnny Storm and his roommate from NYU and journey to Wakanda. Upon arriving on the continent, the FF discover a strange new land, and that's where that's being referenced here, where even the boulders can be heard to hum with the steady pulse of computer dynamos. The FF soon meet T'Challa, though this encounter goes awry when the Black Panther unexplicitly attacks the Fantastic Four. Lee and Kirby use this issue to undo several stereotypes about Africans by granting T'Challa technological expertise, a militaristic discipline, and an egalitarian nobility, even as they ironically evoke stereotypes like Tarzan. For example, when T'Challa confronts Ben Grimm, he doses Grimm with a gas that temporarily removes his super strength because in any equal match, the Black Panther is certain to win. Indeed, T'Challa skillfully defeats each member of the Fantastic Four by effectively neutralizing their otherworldly powers, which is to say, he makes them his equals. However, T'Challa fails to account for the presence of Wyatt Wingfoot, and the athletic Indian, who is a stand-in for the Native American decathlete and football icon Jim Thorpe, foils T'Challa's plans by freeing the Human Torch, who then comes to the aid of his overmatched family, right? And so this is actually really important, right? If you look at the word bubble on his chest, he says, you know, you overlooked one factor. Sometimes a man with no superpowers can tip the scales for or against you. Right, so this is very explicitly a sort of democratic ethos, but of course it's in the mouth of a colonialized subject, right, and that's not an accident, right? Unlike the comics of Fanon's colonial youth, Fantastic Four 52 positions the Negro as superior to the superpowered white Fantastic Four, but then deploys an Indian to rescue the imperiled white protagonist, establishing the competence of both African and Native American subjects in the face of Western hegemony. If, as many as many scholars have argued, the Fantastic Four literizes the post-World War II American nuclear family. The resolution of this issue foregrounds the importance of an inclusive diversity in the post-war American project, as well as the need for cross-racial alliances necessary to produce both a healthy family and a diverse and thriving nation. With this threat neutralized, Richards presses T'Challa to understand why he summoned them to Wakanda only to ambush them. And in the cliffhanger that ends this issue, the Black Panther reveals his true purpose. He needs the Fantastic Four's help to repel a neo-colonial invasion. And that leads us to the next issue. Fantastic Four 53 reveals that Wakanda possesses a unique ore known as vibranium, which we now all know about, a metal possessing the ability to absorb vibrations. Richards quickly realizes that the military applications of this metal, declaring, quote, "It's worth a fortune to our missile program alone. Rockets made of vibranium will never go off course." T'Challa reveals that Wakanda has preserved its independence and wealth by keeping knowledge of vibranium from the outside world. All of this is threatened, though, by a renegade scientist, and it's important that in his initial iteration he's a scientist and not a weapons dealer, by a scientist known as Claw, who seeks to invade Wakanda and seize control of the vibranium in order to make a series of weapons, chief among them a sound transformer that can change the basic sonic energy into anything that he desires. So it's literally like a wish-granting machine. Indeed, Claw invaded Wakanda a decade earlier in order to procure vibranium, and during this conflict, he killed the previous Black Panther, T'Challa's father, T'Chaka. The then teenage T'Challa drove Claw off with one of their own weapons, but not before they devastated the Wakandan countryside in their attempt to reach the mountain where vibranium is mined. And for me, it's funny to write this out and then see it. I'm just like, okay, well, that was pointless. T'Challa has spent the last 10 years preparing for Claw's return, rebuilding his nation by anonymously selling small portions of vibranium on the black market to amass a fortune equal of any nation on Earth, while educating himself at the finest universities in both hemispheres, to the point where, as the construction of the airship and the fabrication of the gas that depowers Ben Grimm demonstrates, his technological acumen rivals that of Reed Richards. Black Panther invited the Fantastic Four to Wakanda in order to test himself, reasoning that if he could fight them to a standstill, he would be more than capable of defending his country against the perfidious Claw. And of course, because coincidences are a thing that always happens, Claw launches his attack as T'Challa is relating this story to the Fantastic Four, and the four Americans work to assist him. The avatars of United States imperialism helping to preserve the sovereignty of an imperiled African nation. The Fantastic Four engage Claw's sound constructs and mercenaries, preventing them from harming the Wakandan populace, while the Black Panther slips behind the front line, confronts Claw, and cripples the machines powering his weapons. Despite his years of training and the Panther powers that derive from the heart-shaped herb, T'Challa defeats Claw. He defeats Claw, and I'm pointing to the bottom corner there. You did not realize I am a scientist too, right? As with his initial counter with the Fantastic Four, T'Challa's victory depends on his intellectual parity with an ostensibly more accomplished figure. The desperate and defeated Claw turns his technology on himself, risking his life to transform himself into a being made of pure sound, but he seems to be defeated. And an interesting inversion here. The pursuit of raw materials led to the invasion of an African nation, but scientific expertise granted an African monarch the means to both attract powerful allies from the West and also the knowledge necessary to defeat his long-standing enemy. According to Ramzi Fawaz, Claw and Black Panther fit into a common narrative dyad in comics that places into opposition, quote, scientists with commitments to scientific self-interest against those who embrace scientific cosmopolitanism. However, Claw's iconography marks him not simply as a scientist, but also as a colonial exploiter, colonizer, as Shiri would say. Claw first appears clad in a pith helmet that accentuates his pitiless, deep-set eyes and sallow complexion. These features, along with his downturned mouth, establish him as a villainous figure. Despite clutching a, quote, futuristic sound transformer powered by vibranium, Claw seems more representative of the 19th century scramble for Africa that partitioned the continent than he does an avatar of post-World War II scientific innovation. While Claw's attire, if not his intentions towards the hidden African kingdom, might seem anachronistic, we must remember that in comic books, this kind of simultaneity is embraced. It allows for incongruous concepts to exist alongside one another, pardon me. The Avengers, for example, count a Norse deity, a World War II super soldier, a Soviet-era super spy, and a sentient android among their membership. An assembling that mixes figures from the mythical past, the science fiction future, and political actors from two bygone eras, right? And so this kind of mashup is a thing. It's a characteristic of comics, right? This anachronism connects Claw's unsavory desire to use science for personal empowerment to his neo-colonial ambitions, and is further emphasized by the mercenaries equipped with weapons arrayed in the background. The text on this page likens Claw to, quote, a greedy ivory hunter, even as Claw himself views his discovery of vibranium in Wakanda as confirmation of his pioneering genius, deepening the connection between his self-serving intention to strip Wakanda of its resources with the atrocities of colonial actors like the Belgium, who discovered rubber and ivory in the Congo. As Fawas notes, in comics, villainous scientists are nearly always misanthropic loners or outcasts who have spent their lives perfecting knowledge of a single specialty in isolation from larger communities of science. And so again, think about T'Challa's approach. He masters technology and then sends that technology to the leading scientist in the world, Reed Richards. He wants confirmation. He wants to be part of a cosmopolitan community. Claw, on the other hand, isolates himself and seeks to use knowledge only for his own personal benefit. Claw then combines the misanthropic isolation with a racial chauvinism demonstrated by his willingness to subdue an independent African nation simply to attain a valuable natural resource. Constructing a narrative in this way, via an artificial and intentional collapsing of past and present, both defines the superhero genre which shapes the Black Panther and also confirms Bembe's assertion that, quote, African existence is neither a linear time nor a simple sequence in which each moment effaces, annuls, and replaces those that preceded. Instead, according to Bembe, Africans live in, quote, a state of entanglement where time is not a series, but an interlocking of presents, past, and futures that retain their depths even as each age bears, alters, and maintains upon the previous one. While Bembe articulates this radical state of simultaneity in order to describe the oscillating and contradictory process by which a nation moves from colony through decolonization to become a post-colony, this notion of entanglement is also a useful way to understand the continuity of superhero comics, or for that matter, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of the characters in the fictive space of the superhero are connected to one another. Not simply because the same corporate body owns their copyright, but via the logic of comic continuity, which is to say, as Bembe would have it, entanglement. Every story in the Marvel Universe connects with every other story, and thus each story exerts a potential revisionist pressure upon every other event, right? And so if you stay to the very end of Black Panther, you saw the White Wolf, and that, that in itself, revises something that we've already encountered if you saw Civil War. But that's enough of the movie, back to the books. Throughout these narratives, vibranium serves as an analog to actual materials found in Africa, like uranium and more recently cobalt, linking raw materials in Africa to the economic and military well-being of the West. And yet, while the vast majority of uranium lies beneath the soil in nations like Gabon, Niger, and Namibia, or once did, Western nations like France, England, and of course the USA and the USSR controlled much of the uranium production on the continent in the post-war period. Thus, Claw's covert invasion resembles Western meddling in Central African nations like the Congo and Angola during the Cold War in order to secure a steady supply of uranium, right? By introducing an independent Wakanda, the Fantastic Four posits an anti-colonial futurity where an African nation might be allowed to control their valuable elements and benefit from their development. As Gabrielle Hecht provocatively observes, nuclearity, which she defines as, quote, a contested techno-political category dependent on history and geography, science and technology, bodies and politics, radiation and race, but primarily upon the possession of refined uranium, defines Cold War notions of modernity by valorizing those nations in possession of nukes over those nations that don't have them, right? And so, I mean, like, how do we define the first world? Well, the first world has nukes. That's literally a definition, not the only definition, but that's a definition, right? And it's important to remember that only one African country has ever possessed nuclear weapons. And of course, that was apartheid South Africa, which, as they saw that, oh, wow, this government's not gonna last, they gave up their nukes. So think this through. Rather than turn the nukes over to Nelson Mandela, they literally, unilaterally disarmed. Right? And so it says something really interesting about the way that, weapons, about how they matter, why they matter, and who gets to control them, that this is the reality. Wakanda, unfortunately, is the fantasy. Okay. Where did I go? Oh, okay. While the West actively excluded African nations from the nuclear club, by a strict control of both the knowledge and materials needed to make the bomb, Lee and Kirby's fiction of Wakanda rivals Western powers through its control of its own resource, which then leads to amazing technological advancement, a tantalizing alternative to the political and economic realities of post-colonial and neo-colonial Africa. Of course, even the fictional Wakanda has to keep itself hidden away in order to develop itself, a nod to the brutal realities of Western expansion from the 16th century to the present. With his nation secure after repulsing Claw's invasion, T'Challa thanks the Fantastic Four for their assistance, relieved that this threat has been neutralized. The FF respond by encouraging T'Challa to continue his adventures, literally pushing him out of the isolationism that has protected Wakanda for centuries by insisting that, quote, the world will always have the need of a dedicated and powerful fighter against injustice. At the Fantastic Four's prodding, T'Challa decides to remain connected to the world, placing the good of the cosmopolitan global society over the preservation of the local community, going so far as to altruistically pledge his fortune, his powers, his very life to the service of all mankind. With this declaration, T'Challa chooses to join the ever-expanding pantheon of heroes in the Marvel Universe, bringing diversity to Marvel's cohort of heroes while radically and irreversibly altering the nature of his relationship to his nation. In short, with this declaration, T'Challa becomes a cosmopolitan figure. Before returning to the implications of this choice, we should attend to the Black Panther's now iconic character design. Jack Kirby is perhaps the most influential and inventive illustrator in the history of comics. While many of his artistic peers were responsible for the design of a single character, Bob Kane created Batman, Joe Shuster created Superman, Steve Ditko created Spider-Man, Kirby produced dozens. In addition to the Black Panther, Kirby brought his signature style to designs for, and this is a partial list because we'd be here all night. So Kirby created Black Panther's visual look. He also created Ant-Man, Captain America, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, Nick Fury, Iron Man, Thor, the X-Men, Darkseid. And it goes on and on and on. Curiously, the Black Panther's character design evinces little of the inventiveness Kirby displayed with some of these other characters. In fact, his costume, an all-black jumpsuit with a full cowl and a half cape that leaves his eyes his most notable feature, functions almost as a declaration of absence. This is perhaps even more striking when contrasted with the colorful, distinctive appearance of other Kirby heroes. It's possible, however, that the relative simplicity of Black Panther's costume reflects a particular attitude towards illustrating blackness. If this is true, then Kirby's use of a black costume intensifies T'Challa's blackness, the costume foregrounding the absence of black heroes while simultaneously calling attention to the ethnicity that the uniform conceals. As Blair Davis notes, comic book artists often conflate black heroic iconography with black masculine identity. To put it another way, black heroes like T'Challa often lack a symbol as graphically arresting as, quote, Superman's cape, Batman's cowl, their respective chest symbols, as well as Captain America's American flag color scheme, which are so visually distinct that they prove highly memorable, along with the fact that such imagery plays an ongoing role in characterization of each hero. Right, so this is a typical thing. Typically, you'll have a hero with a distinctive, marking like Superman, Batman, Captain America. But for black heroes, the fact of their blackness often seems to be enough to differentiate them from their counterparts. And if you think about, Luke Cage just wears a hoodie, right? He doesn't need a costume, he just has a hoodie. Resulting in more undistinguished costumes. Interestingly, however, the anonymous absence built into Black Panther's ebon costume may make a process of identification easier for comic readers who approach the character looking for representation of themselves. If you are attracted to the Black Panther by virtue of his blackness, his costume's blackness serves to reinforce this connection. In a medium where nearly every significant character, including Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man, have had major costume changes over the last 50 years, that the Black Panther's appearance has changed very little since his debut suggests that this simplicity continues to serve him well. Right? Okay, so the events of Fantastic Four 52 and 53 established Black Panther as a cosmopolitan citizen willing to place his obligation to mankind above his patriotic duty to protect Wakanda. But much of his distinctiveness is lost when he fights alongside the Avengers. And this is the team he joins in 1968. So he debuts in 66, 2 years later he becomes part of the Avengers, right? On the Avengers, T'Challa is just one exceptional figure among many other living in and around New York City. A prince of Wakanda serving alongside a prince from Asgard, a super soldier, and an ironclad captain of industry. But attempts to tell stories grounded in Africa have proven uneven at best. One lamentable example of this is Fantastic Four 119, which betrays a retrograde understanding of both international and American race relations, cynically exploits T'Challa's status as an African subject, as well as Ben Grimm's working class persona in the hopes of saying something important about race, right? It's very ham-fisted. Written by Roy Thomas and illustrated by John Buscema and Joe Sinnott, the story takes place in Rudyarda, a fictionalized version of South Africa named for the English poet, novelist, and colonizer Rudyard Kipling. So we have Rudyardia after Rudyard Kipling. The entire issue serves as a ham-fisted exercise in consciousness raising at the expense of T'Challa's agency. Wakanda has traced the theft of a device capable of weaponizing vibranium to Rudyardia, right, to South Africa. And when T'Challa investigates the incident, he was captured and placed in prison. The South Africans, the Rudyardians, suspect that their prisoner might be of importance, but don't realize that he is a head of state. So this is where Wakanda's, hiding itself is serving him well. They think he's just a spy. They think he's Nakia, right? But he's much more than that, right? Wakanda needs him rescued, but T'Challa can't reveal himself without setting off an international incident. Thus, one of T'Challa's aides, let's call him Wakabi, asks if the FF can intervene on their behalf. While this plot seems plausible enough for a comic book, Ben Grimm's antics reveal that the primary motivation of this issue is to sort of identify the problems of race in Africa. Again and again, Grimm, who was clearly meant to stand in for a white suburban reader, reveals his ignorance about the state of affairs over there, right? And so here, we have him saying, that nation is one, and by the way, as far as I can tell, this is the first mention of the phrase white supremacy in a comic book in 1972. So it's a terrible issue, but it does have that one thing going for it. And so of course, the Wakandan diplomat says, one of my color can function there only with difficulty. And Ben Grimm is like, oh yeah, I forgot, right? In Rudyardia, Grimm seems more Archie Bunker than superhero, with Johnny Storm serving as his liberal sidekick, right? And so here they've actually, I don't know why, they have like rocket ships, but they took a plane. Like they took a commercial flight to South Africa instead of like flying on their own, but okay, sure. So when they arrive at the airport, well actually, they took a commercial flight so that this scene could happen. And this is what I mean about it being bad writing, right? When they arrive at the airport, he can't get a cab, right? And then we have the liberal do-gooder, Johnny Storm, a good NYU student, saying, maybe a black man trying to get to Harlem, right? And so like drawing this direct connection here, whereas Ben like, what's going on? I don't get it. I don't understand what's happening, right? He literally picks up a cab because he's that strong. And when he puts his head in, the racist driver says, say, I know you. You're the Thing, one of the American Fantastic Four. Hop in. Sorry I didn't stop at first, but I took you for, and he's like, yeah, shut up, right? And so here we have, and this is all being played very clearly for comic relief, right? White supremacy, segregation, apartheid as a joke. However, when Johnny Storm and Ben Grimm invade the prison, the stakes change in a way that I think the author of the text doesn't realize, right? So here they are breaking into the prison, and we have someone saying, free me, no, free me, I'm a political prisoner. and he's dismissed out of hand, not because the cause is not just, but essentially because we're in a hurry. Right? And so here, if Fantastic Four 52 offered American hegemony in a good way, you know, we're going to preserve the independence of an African nation. This is American hegemony. This is the flip side of that, right? Where we can't be bothered because we have a mission to free this one person, and we're not going to adjudicate anything else, right? So. But even so, all of this serves to establish, even if it's done in bad taste, all of this establishes that Rudyardia, aka South Africa, is a repressive and racially stratified nation, you know, a nation that is unjust, that deserves boycotts and deserves all of the protests that were sort of just beginning in the early 1970s. And at this point, by the way, Mandela had been in jail. He was arrested in 1970, so in 72 he's been in jail for 2 years, right? And so, you know, just to provide a little context here. So even if they're doing it, what I'm saying is even if they're doing a bad job of it, they're at least trying to establish a real world connection to a current social problem, right? So A for effort, F for execution. But all of that is undermined. All of that is undermined when they break him out and he changes into his costume, right? T'Challa now wants to be called the Black Leopard and not the Black Panther. And if you look in the middle top, he says, I contemplate a return to your country, Ben, where the latter term, Black Panther, has political connotations. I neither condemn nor condone those who have taken up the name, but T'Challa is a law unto himself, right? So, T'Challa justifies changing his name by stating that he wishes to avoid the political associations of the Black Panther Party when he returns to the United States. But his phrasing, quote, I contemplate a return to your country, suggests that T'Challa fears, accurately as it turns out, he might be prohibited from entering if the American government misunderstands his allegiances. Right? This comment establishes a moral equivalency between apartheid South Africa and post-war US, since T'Challa is unable to operate in either locale as the Black Panther. The racial myopia that enabled this unintended inference continues when, after recovering the vibranium weapons, Ben Grimm destroys the gate of the prison that recently held T'Challa, right? And so again, it's like, you know, that's the MacGuffin. There's a weapon. If this weapon isn't stopped, it could, you know, vibranium could blow up and blow up the world, blah, blah, blah. The interesting thing is here, beautiful. You break your back saving the world, then you gotta walk out through separate but equal doors. And we have the good liberal Johnny Storm with Peanut Gallery comic, kind of makes you wonder if it was worth it, huh? And so of course, he does what would seem to be a righteous thing by destroying this. And so you think, okay, so here we have it, right? We have American empire at work to tear down this wall and destroy this thing, right? Except for the fact that it is immediately undercut with the next panel, right? So here we see T'Challa attempts to thank his friend for freeing him and doing all the things that he did in this issue. And he says, forget it. I didn't do that for you, I did it for me. Right? Again, speaking with unintended insight, Grimm declares that he took this action not to strike out against the corruption of South Africa or to symbolize his newfound commitment to anti-racism, but instead as a symbolic gesture intended to give him pleasure, sort of like voting for Trump and then wearing a pink hat. Indeed, when T'Challa attempts to thank Ben for his efforts, he's rudely dismissed. Fantastic Four 119 represents a low point in the depiction of the Black Panther, but one that provides unintended insight into the reasoning of the liberal right writers that dominated the comics industry and also dominated Hollywood and television and so on and so forth. But 40 years after this initial appearance, the filmmaker Reginald Hudlin was given reins of the character. Building upon the excellent work of people who came before him, like Don McGregor and Christopher Priest, Hudlin folded Wakanda even deeper into Marvel's continuity by strengthening the Black Panther's cosmopolitan engagement with Marvel's history. Initially in 2005's Black Panther reboot, which he launched with John Romita Jr., but also in the 2010 miniseries Captain America and Black Panther, Flags of Our Fathers. And this is done with the African-American artist Dennis Cohen. And as far as I can tell, this is the first time you have a Black writer and a Black artist collaborating on the Black Panther. So you have two Black Americans doing the work here, right? So By presenting, and so what this does though, this is retroactive continuity, which again takes us back to Bembe's notion of entanglement, that the past, the present, and the futures oscillate all together at the same time, right? This takes us to not T'Challa or even T'Chaka, but to T'Challa's grandfather, Azuri the Wise. And by doing so, it ties Wakanda into the anti-fascist and anti-colonial history during World War II, which was only gestured at by Lee and Kirby. While Black Panther's 1966 debut positioned Wakanda as newly prosperous, Hudlin extends Wakandan history by transforming the Hidden Kingdom into a thriving technological powerhouse with a cultural legacy spanning millennia, right? And so this is where you have the Black writer sort of updating and deepening the efforts of Stanley and Jack Kirby. Right? Hudlin also expands the Black Panther's lineage by introducing a 19th century ancestor, the great Black Panther that kept Wakanda free during the scramble for Africa, in addition to his grandfather, Azuri the Wise, who defended the nation during World War II. Right? So no longer is T'Chaka the transformational figure of the decolonization period that modernized Wakanda. Instead, he is now transformed into, a member of a distinguished lineage, right? And so we have this this revisionist history that sort of complicates and deepens everything, right? Hudlin also revises T'Challa's conflict with Claw, turning what was once a neo-colonial affair into a generational conflict by revealing that Claw is himself South African, no longer just a nameless ethnicity, and that his great-grandfather was killed during an incursion into Wakanda, after which Claw left for Belgium, right? So it does a nice little triangulation there. Hudlin also alters how T'Chaka met his demise, shifting the site of Claw's assassination from Wakanda to an international meeting. And so this mirrors the movie where he's killed in the movie at the UN, right? And so that's Hudlin doing that in 2010, sort of shifting the character around, right? Hudlin's T'Challa remains a charismatic leader who strives to find a balance between maintaining the traditions of his nation with his knowledge of the outside world, but his cultural context has been radically transformed. Linkages to the real-world histories of South Africa and Belgium, narratives scarcely imagined by Lee and Kirby, now define T'Challa's character. With these and other revisions, Hudlin engages a literary practice that Ramsey Fawaz, who I quoted before, terms popular fantasy. Popular fantasy, quote, sutures together current social and political realities and impossible happenings, producing widely shared political myths that describe the legitimate nascent cultural desires or modes of sociality for which no legitimate discourse yet exists. That's a fancy way of saying if you want to go to Wakanda, that's the reason why you want to go to Wakanda, right? It's popular fantasy, right? It's the reason why some people want to go to Hogwarts and why people can play Quidditch, which, how do you play Quidditch? Anyway. The seemingly impossible character of popular fantasy signals the continued otherness of the social realities they seek to escape, while making the otherness desirable as an alternative to what's real and normal. Right? So Hudlin's revision of the Black Panther exploits the frustration of people of African descent in the Americas, whose desire for a truly autonomous motherland capable of sheltering them from the depredations of the West extends back hundreds of years. And I want to point out I wrote this before I saw the movie. By positing the fictional Wakanda as this longed-for motherland, Hudlin recast the nation as an incorruptible vessel of cosmopolitan and nationalistic pride for all people of African descent, right? And interestingly, in this limited series, the point of view character is neither the Black Panther nor Captain America, which you would think with these guys on the cover, it's going to follow them around. It doesn't follow them around. Instead, it follows around Gabriel Jones, the only African-American member of the US military's elite Howling Commando, sort of like a SEAL Team 6 before SEAL Team 6. Jones's presence in this elite force connects him to other notable Black American war heroes, such as the 761st Tank Battalion that fought under Patton, or the Harlem Hellfighters that got glory during World War I, led by James Europe. And so we could sort of see that here, where he says, here's Nick Fury, and yes, in the comics Nick Fury is white, but of course they changed him to Sam Jackson. So just think of Sam Jackson, but it's not Sam Jackson. But when he put the squad together, he had his pick of the litter. He didn't care that the army wasn't integrated yet. He just wanted guys who could knock a Nazi's block off, right? And so here we have an explicit appeal to black exceptionalism, right? If I'm good enough, even if the nation doesn't recognize my talent, there's a way forward for me, right? And so he happily joins and is, he's the first, one of many, sort of first, the first member of this elite, the first black member of this elite commando force, right? And once again, a colonizing force seeks to conquer Wakanda in order to acquire vibranium ore, this time a battalion of Nazis led by the Red Skull and Baron Strucker. While Captain America and the rest of the Howling Commandos assist Azuri the Wise, who's then the Black Panther, in driving off the Nazis, Jones struggles between his duty to his nation and his admiration for Wakanda, right? And so this is made very explicit, right? So here's Nick Fury. We need the firepower to protect people who don't think they need the help. Because if the Nazis get their hands on what's here, vibranium, it's over for the rest of the world. What are you asking me to do? Find the vibranium. That's what the Nazis are here for. We've got to get to it first, right? So in other words, trade on your racial identity, trade on your heritage as an African in the diaspora to get close enough to locate this thing so that America and not the Nazis can have it, right? So this is obviously a much more complex rendering than the rendering of Rudyardia. His response, and I'm the perfect guy to steal some sacred rocks from the natives. The rest of the Howlers, the rest of the commandos are going back into the jungle to find the German base camp. If the Wakandans liked Reb more than you, I'd be giving this assignment to him. Saving lives can be a dirty business. I just need to know if I can count on you to follow orders, Private. And it's interesting because he doesn't, Fury doesn't often refer to him this way. You can count on me, sir. Right? So, while the U.S. military anxiously seeks to keep the Axis powers from obtaining vibranium, they also want to learn more about it, learn more about the fabled and mysterious Wakanda, and potentially procure a supply of the ore for themselves, right? Jones accepts his mission with obvious reluctance, and the resolution of the narrative doesn't hang on whether the Nazis lose, because the Nazis always lose. Instead, it hangs on whether he is going to betray his government or the technologically advanced African nation that he has come to identify with, right? And so we see there's a scene here, and this is important. This is after he's taken on the mission to, sort of infiltrate Wakanda, right? Heaven, I've never seen anything like this. Stores full of food, happy kids, folks operating machines I've never seen before. No wonder they have to keep it secret. The world isn't ready for this, right? Jones's comments when he travels through the markets of Barenzana, that's the capital of Wakanda, are meant to contrast the privation of life in the US with the plenitude, the paradise, and it's repeatedly referred to as a paradise that we experience here. So of course, the Nazis lose, because that's what they do in comic books. The Nazis lose, Jones acquits himself heroically. In fact, he saves the life of Azuri's queen, and in appreciation, Azuri offers him Wakandan citizenship, right? And this is a fascinating scene. It's not that I don't appreciate the offer of citizenship, but even if I lived here, I still want to fight this fight. And when I go home, I got to fight that fight too. I can't leave everyone else behind. Killmonger? Anyway, sorry. Right? Of course, this fight references World War II. And that fight is segregation and racial discrimination that continues to divide America. Gabe Jones has the opportunity to leave it all behind and melt into the paradise that is Wakanda, but he continues with the mission, right? And so this is, again, interesting, and it's an interesting sort of anticipation of some of the themes of the movie as well, which we can obviously talk about. But of course, having rejected Wakandan citizenship, it means that he still has to answer to his commanding officer, right? If you're asking me if I got it, I didn't. They had eyes on me the whole time. I don't believe you. You're too good. You were too in. Sorry, Nick, but those are the facts. In fact, these aren't the facts. He had several opportunities to procure vibranium and chose not to. He chose, to sort of split the difference, right? How can I, an African in America, sort of hold true to both? well, we can keep the Nazis from getting it, we can keep the bad people from getting the thing without stealing it for ourselves. And so he finds sort of a middle way between what Azzurri would want him to do, which is to renounce US citizenship and come be with your brothers, and what Nick Fury wants him to do, which is to betray his ideals, right? Maybe it's not clear where your loyalties are. Want to stay in paradise? Of course, he doesn't know, Nick Fury doesn't know that he's already had the opportunity and has turned it down, right? Which leads to this contentious thing, I do, right? And so contrast what he says to Azzurri with what he says to his commanding officer. I do, but I'm here anyway. If that's not good enough for you, let me know. Confronted with the obvious duplicity of one of his elite commandos, but also confronted with the conflicting desires of an African-American subject, Nick Fury chooses to take the high road. Fair enough. Black Panther, Captain America Flags of Our Father, relates an untold tale from World War II that simultaneously deepens the connection between Wakanda and Black Americans at the expense of American exceptionalism exhibited by the so-called Greatest Generation. The story serves as an interesting coda to Hudlin's run on the character and also anticipates many of the moves made by Ryan Coogler's fabulously successful Black Panther movie. Fair enough.
So maybe a place to start, since so many people here are more familiar with the movie than the comics, and I don't want to bore everyone with deep comic nerdery like I know we can do.
You can.
So one of the things you suggested near the end of your talk was that this idealized notion of Wakanda now is becoming problematized in a way. So I know in the film that happens with the fate of Killmonger,
right,
being left behind, and what happened to his father, and the inability to, or the unwillingness for T'Chaka to take on the problems of African Americans. And I know in Ta-Nehisi Coates' run, he reveals that there is a colonial history.
We're not going to talk about that.
But that's what I'm asking you about. Oh. I'm not asking you about that specifically. I'm just asking you about why do you think that now that Wakanda has been established as this idealized place, suddenly creators, whether it's in the film or in the comics, are starting to undermine that a little bit, problematize it, and make it seem a little more real in that sense. Right.
I mean, I think there is no Camelot. Right. I mean, we've had some of us are older and remember the original Camelot, which is the JFK administration. It was a time of intense hope here. Oh my God, we are going to achieve so much, and it sort of didn't happen. Right. That same spirit, sort of imbued the Obama administration. So we sort of put these hopeful thoughts out into the air, but reality is always messier than that, right? So I think it's just good art where they're saying, okay, one, it's affirming. It's truly life affirming to sort of see, just to see the Dora Milaje or just to see so many things. It's just like, oh my God, I want to move to this place, right? But every society has problems. Every society is implicated in some way. And that's the tension between, it's really a triangle, right? It's not this like neat, like Killmonger here, T'Challa here. It's also Nakia, right? Nakia wants to engage in the world in a particular kind of a way, and I'm sort of frustrated on Twitter. People are like glossing over and like making it about the men when it's really and whose vision winds up, winning is her vision, right? Nakia, I found a way for you to have your falling, right? He tells her in that moment, and so it's her vision that wins, and so I think. That sort of complication is necessary, right? I mean, even Hogwarts has Voldemort, right? There is no pure place.
Right, and they also have slave labor in the form of house elves.
Oh, that's true, right?
Don't ever forget that.
Right.
So, what do you make of? I was also thinking about what you were saying in terms of the entanglements and how comic continuity, reflects those entanglements. Do you think that, however? Because I know when I write a lot about comic continuity in my own work, and one of the things that I'm always interested in is how, because of the necessity for these stories, the way these stories are written to continually build on each other,
Right.
connect to each other,
Right.
that they're also burdened with those less than spectacular representations of, I won't even say past stories, because
Right.
a future story can,
Right.
you know, there's recent stories that still aren't
Right.
doing the job.
Right, right,
So
right.
how do we make sense of that? How do we
Right.
both take advantage of the positive possibilities of that interconnectedness, of that entanglement, but also understand that that means that we always, the current comic writer or filmmaker, whoever,
Right.
has to account for this history that's been written, and that comic nerds especially are always going to remind you of.
I mean, I think we're living in that moment now. I mean, like, a good question would be, how can the same company produce the racial politics of Doctor Strange, the racial politics of Iron Fist, and the racial politics of Black Panther, right? It's just like, wow, these other two are so problematic, and this other one is so sort of emancipatory and liberatory, right? And it's like, well, who's being empowered, right? And so I think that, you know, it's an exciting time where, you know, Ava DuVernay, Ryan Coogler, Jordan Peele, Malcolm Lee. Malcolm Lee did Girls Trip, the #1 comedy of the year. Like, these are the 4 of the top 10 directors, you know, 4 of the top 10 films of the last, you know, 18 months. And what that means is more, right? And so I think, you know, in the same way that Ta-Nehisi is able to sort of problematize, you know, this idea of like African perfection in the book, we just need to support those artists, right? And you guys need to complain on Twitter when things aren't right, because it actually does make a big difference, you know?
You know, complaining on Twitter makes a difference.
No, I mean, it does. It really does.
I mean, I do it a lot, but I don't know. I haven't noticed yet, personally. Great. I'm trying to think. You covered so much, so it's hard to pinpoint one thing that I wanted to talk about. So what about the actual representation of Wakanda itself? So that's also, I mean, I don't know how familiar people are with comics, but depending on who's drawing and at what time,
right.
Wakanda looks very different.
Right, yeah.
And Kirby's vision of this combination jungle techno paradise
Right.
is not what you see, for example, when someone like John Romita Jr. draws.
Right,
They're
right,
in the
right.
Headland Rock.
Right.
So what do you make of those competing things? In some ways, to make Wakanda legible, some artists have to go back to stereotypical
Right.
representations of African people.
Right.
And they look like they're going to Tarzan for their like information, as opposed to
Right.
So,
I mean, I think part of the fun of anything is seeing how, seeing what an artist will bring to it, right? I mean, at this point, we have, to sort of shift your question a little bit, we've had 3 different Spider-Men, right? And I don't know of anyone who liked the one in the middle. But the Spider-Man on either end, you know, they have their sort of devotees. So I don't have a problem with that. I think the conceptual space is more important than how it's rendered, if that makes sense, right? Because I mean, so much of it is an act of the imagination, right? Although, you know, I kind of feel bad for the comic artists now, because like the world of Wakanda now exists in a way that it didn't before, right? Like Mbuku's throne room is incredible, like that scene with all the branches hanging, and it's just it's just so beautiful, and I'm just like, damn, so someone's trapped now. That's Wakanda, right? And so there's a way in which the comics have an openness that the films close off, right? Because and this is actually a real world problem that they're having. I'm not going to spoil anything. Well, I am going to spoil something. No. Spoil it. All right. So people are going to die in the next Avengers movie. And the reason they're going to die is simply because Disney is tired of paying certain actors $20 and $30 and $40 million a film, right? And it's just like, damn it, like, but that person has come to own it, right? I mean, and like, look at Logan, the movie Logan, which is nominated for an Academy Award, right? That movie ends with the character dying because Hugh Jackman has so completely embodied Logan that you can't imagine anyone else playing him, right? And so there's a way in which the comics have an openness that the films, you know, if you're lucky enough to get a performance like a Hugh Jackman performance, it closes it off, right? Who's going to be Deadpool after Ryan Reynolds? Nobody. Like, Ryan Reynolds killed, you know, he's Deadpool. That's it, right? So I think that, you know, one of the charms of comics is the openness of it, the way you can sort of reconfigure and reimagine things. But you know, the movies are awesome too. So
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about audience and reader reception to some of this stuff? I don't know how. I mean, just recently I was reading, in preparing for this, I was reading the letters of people who wrote into Fantastic Four.
Right.
When Black Panther showed up.
So hold on, I actually want to pause. Can we open it up to the audience and have the audience give us their receptions as well, so that we can sort of
All right. That sounds good. So we have questions.
Hands and then stand. Oh, there's a mic. Hold on.
Thanks for the really great talk. I shot my hand up because what was in my mind was related to the specific topic. I was hoping you could expand upon a little bit who was the intended audience of, especially the early Black Panther vision. Was the kind of milquetoast portrayal of race relations intended to pacify and bring in a kind of increasingly militant Black American community into the Marvel consumership, or was it more egalitarian but poorly implemented and aimed towards the kind of white suburban, liberal-leaning audience who were already reading?
Sure. So Stan Lee is a marketer, right? I mean, he's a good writer. He's a great marketer. So one of the things that the civil rights movement did is it made visible what we would now call a Black middle class, right? And so, I mean, again, it's not a coincidence that you get like Sidney Poitier and you get some of these other figures, right? So Stan Lee is like, oh, well, there's a market for this, because there's a market for Sidney Poitier now. There's a market for Harry Belafonte, so there's a market for this. So let's do an African hero that's never been done before. Let's do it. And he then turns it over to Jack Kirby, and Jack Kirby, who, as you know, I showed you with the Captain America cover, with the Orion cover, like Orion fights for Earth. Like he's got this much, you know, grander sort of idea, and so he creates this, you know, iconic hero, and he's like, oh, okay, great, right? I see in that moment, the moment of pushing him out of Wakanda, that's totally Stan Lee, right? Like we can't have this cool ass character that we just created over these 2 issues and leave him stranded in Africa. So we gotta get you out into the rest of the world because we need you. Right? And so I think it was a little bit of both. I mean, I think for Stan Lee, he's looking around, literally looking around, like walking down 42nd Street and seeing, you know, oh, Sidney Poitier is in a film and it seems to be doing well. We need some of that, right? And so this is his, and it's not his only one. Like, so, you know, we get Black Panther in 66, we get the Falcon in 68, we get Luke Cage in 71, we get Storm in 73. Right, so in this really brief period, you get these, you know, and actually it's actually sad because they remain like the 4 most prominent like people of like Black people in comics to this day, right? And it was literally like, oh, hey, these things are doing well. Oh, wow, blaxploitation's doing well. Let's do that. Oh, well, we need a woman character. Oh, let's do Storm. And he's either writing or he's the editor-in-chief, which means he's, you know, sort of giving it the final stamp of approval, right? And so for me, it's ironic but unsurprising that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are more progressive in 1966 or 68 than the people writing in 78 or 88 or 98, right? It's sort of frustrating, but that's where we are. So.
When I recall reading that issue that you brought up, it reminded me of being a teenager back in those days. And I think that one of the things that Lee and Kirby were, besides being Jewish, they were Jewish New Yorkers.
Right.
And I think that New Yorker part of them, particularly when you read Peter Parker when you were a kid, and all of a sudden the vulnerabilities of a teenager are what you are come on screen.
Right.
And now you see this, what we start to see in the 60s was this mythologizing of Africa, which we were just becoming acquainted with at that point in time, coming to grips with that. I wanted you to speak a little bit about the mythology that was created between the comic and the film,
right?
And what impact was on Twitter and
right.
Facebook and everybody. That's all we're hearing about. So,
right.
Your thoughts about that?
So, ironically, probably the most important mythologizer between Kirby and Lee, and black guys don't get to write Black Panther until 1998. Right, and so there's like 66 to 98. It's a bunch of white writers. None of them are as good or as progressive as Kirby and Lee, except for one, Don McGregor. Right, Don McGregor is this like.
Didn't Billy Graham draw that?
Yeah, and Billy Graham is
not the preacher Billy Graham, the that just passed away. Right. No, the good Billy Graham.
He was the only African American artist working at Marvel, so he was like the token, and he was paired up with Billy Graham. He lived in the Bronx. Graham lived in Lincoln Center, which wasn't yet torn down. And they used to get on the train and meet in Harlem and sit and plot it out, right? And so he created a lot of what we think of as Wakanda in the film. He created Killmonger. He created M'Baku. He created some of the love interests that then were transformed into the Dora Milaje later, right? And so it's a tricky thing, right? Where this character has many forefathers, right? But if we're going chronologically, the three initial most important forefathers, three of the four, because Graham is an African American artist, three of the four most important forefathers are white, right? And so but again, it's a different time, right? At the same time that Graham is writing Black Panther and doing all of that work, you also have Norman Lear doing, All in the Family, doing Good Times, doing The Jeffersons, doing Maude, where we're getting like a lesbian character, and it's like, so it's these weird sort of iterations and things are happening, right? And so, I mean, again, this is why I'm fond of this idea of entanglement. Right, because it's like, because of some new show, we're getting like queer representation, and I'm like, Maude, in 1975, had lesbians like living together, like queer representation. What are you talking about, right? But these things aren't linear. They sort of curve back on themselves. So yeah, that's. But yeah, I mean, I think it actually is an organic thing. It's a living thing, right? And just to sort of reference something else, when I said complain on Twitter, the actress, and I'm blanking on her name right now, who played the Ancient One in Doctor Strange, Tilda Swinton issued this cringe-inducing apology about why she was playing this ancient Asian mystical character. Without Twitter, that doesn't happen. That's what I'm saying. I mean, Oscar So White, which has changed the way that we look at the Academy Awards and award season, is a Twitter hashtag. That's what it was, right? And so again, I think it's easy to be dismissive of social media, but I think those are two sort of real examples of social media pushing us in a more inclusive and more progressive direction, right? Social media also gave us Trump in the form of Facebook, so win some, lose some.
Other questions?
Yes, you.
So, as a disclaimer, I'm actually a huge comic book fan, and my concentration involves history of comics.
Woo!
So, this is a more general question about comics and representation in general.
Sure.
I seem to... I personally think that the part of the reason Marvel tended to get these things out more quickly is because they didn't have the same sort of invested interest in the comic code authorities that which DC was part of forming. Because DC didn't have its first black superhero till I think early '70s with John Stewart.
Yeah.
It's actually Mal Duncan.
I was and
It
Ty
was?
Rock.
Oh, never mind then.
Anyway, nerding out. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's fine. Then no, that's good. I know that. I was wondering. This was much more articulate in my head. Sorry. I was wondering, how big of a role do you think the idea of the comic code authorities and kind of this white bread, we need to preserve American style early Cold War values played into slowing down progress in comics?
Sure.
And sorry if that question's out there for people who just want to talk about the movie.
No. It's fine. I'm sorry. What's your name? Sarah. So what Sarah's referencing is the fact that during McCarthyism, comics were put on trial. So the same way today people talk about video games, like, you know, video games are going to turn you into, they talked about comics that way in the 1950s. So during the McCarthy era, comics were put on trial, and the solution was essentially to have a rating system, a comic code authority, where, you know, the comics couldn't undermine the social good, whatever the hell that meant, right? And what it did is it drove a lot of comic book companies out of business, right? A lot of the creators who were doing really subversive and crazy comics, they said, well, we're not gonna do comics, we're gonna do Mad Magazine, right? So all the people who did Mad Magazine were pushed out of the comic industry because of this restrictive code, right? And so, yeah, I think that, you know, we're still living with that history, of course we are, right? And it's the same way that Hollywood is still living with, like, the history of blacklisting, right? That certain stories couldn't be told for a period of time, and if you go to other cinema, if you go to Italy, if you go to France, if you go to Japan, they're engaging in issues that aren't happening here, in part because of the blacklist, right? So I think that if you want to research it, like, one way to make that argument is to parallel it with what we know about the blacklist and the role that that had in shrinking what was possible in film, right? I think that, yeah, I think you're right that the code did the same thing, and I think it's important that Marvel is born after the code, and so like anything else. You know, in some ways, DC was, you know, because they lived through it, they felt much more constrained by it. To sort of use another example, in the same way that, like, all the comedians after Lenny Bruce benefited from Lenny Bruce getting arrested and getting, you know, censured for being too radical, I think that, yeah, Marvel totally benefited from Mad Magazine and from all the things that happened, right? Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true, and there are a couple of ways to sort of think through that.
And there are actually a couple of well-documented examples of the Comics Code Authority micromanaging the representation of black.
Yep.
Do you remember the beads of sweat?
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't draw a black man with beads of sweat. They said, no, you got to take the sweat out because I don't know what exactly.
It implied that he thought that he was in danger. Whether he was in danger, he was in danger, right? But the beads of sweat is like him knowing, like, white supremacy is real. Like, that's what that was. And it's like, oh, no. The beads of sweat are, you know, signal a kind of interiority that is, like, dangerous, right? Like, we can't have that, right? And so, yeah. But yes, I mean, that's a pretty funny example. So, is there a mic? Oh, hold on.
This is great. This is wild. And my question is about, it's a point of clarification. Did I hear you say that the Dora Milaje, or, like, female characters within the Black Panther comic series, started as love interests? Was it later that they shifted to being more associated with fighting and militarism? Can you talk about that shift?
So yeah, so the Dora Milaje are created by Christopher Priest. Christopher Priest is the first black man to write, black person to write Black Panther, and he introduces sort of, if you guys remember Coming to America, you remember, like, the opening scene where, you know, all the beautiful nubile women are bathing the prince, and, you know, so the Dora Milaje were sort of, that was their role. You know, now this is all happening off screen, right? Because it's the comic book, right? But it was clear that, like, he was gonna marry one of them, right? And so they were both translators, diplomats. They were aides. They were also aides. Like, they weren't just sexual objects, but they were, like, aide de camps to him. And it was later that they became increasingly militaristic, and it's actually, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates that made them into this, like, sort of elite fighting force, right? And so it's an interesting evolution where they were complex characters, right? But they were definitely sex symbols and originally, right? Sort of like Charlie's Angels, right? So, like, think about Charlie's Angels, that's what they were, and then they evolved from being like Charlie's Angels to being what you see now, which people, you know, love the Dora to death, right? And it's so important, right? And in fact, that's one of the only sort of notes of discord I've sort of seen in social media, because the Dora are a lot of them are queer, right? They're lesbians, and you know, and it's like, hey, how come that wasn't represented in the film? Right? People are sort of pissed. It's like, you had all this other stuff, but you didn't have, like, where was queer Wakanda? We know it exists because it exists in these comic books, right? And so, and to that I would say, you know, Ryan Coogler's the man, but his boss is still Disney. They let him get away with a lot, You know, he did. I'm amazed at some of the things that are in that film. But if you want to see those representations, Ta-Nehisi's book, and there's a spin-off written by Roxane Gay that gets much more into that sort of
Prematurely canceled.
yeah, but it's out. You can the issues are easy to find, and so you can sort of. I mean, that's it's there. It's out there now, and this is what I mean about comics are sort of constantly always being updated, right? They're always sort of so something that started off as sort of titillation winds up being a symbol of empowerment, right? And it's not that long ago. 1998 to now is not that long ago, and that change happened pretty quickly, Yes. And then JJ.
I'm going to go to the film for a second, and very
course.
specifically the production design. It is, well, the thing about it, yeah, it's glorious. And it's very, very specifically Pan-African. And a little voice in the back of my head kept hearing Benji Wainaina and Africa is not a country. And I wonder, we've had a dozen years of writers working very hard to particularize Africa. Is Wakanda going to homogenize it again?
I mean, I have no idea. But I would say that how should I put this? Wakanda is just as real as Hogwarts, right? It's just as real as oh God, the world of Game of Thrones. What's that world called? Westeros. Thank you. Whew. I failed as a nerd in that moment. It's just as real as Westeros. It's just as real as anything else. I think the important thing is, and I think the Pan-Africanist vision is an important one, right? And so I think so. For example, the fact that most of the Wakandans were speaking with a Southern African accent, and we're speaking some of the time they're speaking Hausa, not Hausa, but help. Thank you. Right. Kosa, thank you. They're speaking Kosa, but then the Jabari are speaking with a Nigerian accent, right? So I think that like those moments of specificity are there, right? And we know that cultures migrate, right? Like there is cultural exchange. So if we have this kingdom that it has its feelers out all over the world, why wouldn't they take from the best that everyone else has to offer, right? I think it's going to make different. So, for example, it's going to make different representations of Africa possible. And once again, my names are failing me. Nakia, the actress who plays Nakia, her name is Lupita Nyong'o. Thank you. Lupita Nyong'o just optioned Trevor Noah's life story, and she's going to be doing a film. Because Trevor Noah's mother was a black woman and married a white man, though he was abusive, but he was also prohibited from living with the family, and it's a very complex thing, and it's just like she announces it, 2 days ago, right? I'm sure that deal came together very quickly on the back of all the records falling, right? And on the back of her being, not just an Academy Award winner, but the star of a blockbuster, right? So I think that Wakanda is good for allowing a specific African story to be told, right? So I don't see that there will be a long-term negative effect. I mean, there's always going to be imitation, right? But there's nothing you can do about that. So, JJ, hi JJ. My students are here too, so I'm very gratified.
You stated two inconsistencies with Marvel's handling of superheroes, as well as how they produce their shows in Iron Fist, as well as Doctor Strange.
Right.
With also how Black Panther has been written in the comics, how it's been inconsistently progressive.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that Marvel's going to be able to keep up, I guess, how they've handled Black Panther as a movie with how they went full in on the casting and everything?
Right.
Or do you see it as being a one-time thing that they're not able to capitalize on, rather than they're not able to normalize the importance of Black Panther as a character?
Right. So right now, Black Panther is on pace. I'm not sure it's going to keep up this pace, but it's on pace to be the #3 grossing movie of all time, right? Avatar, Titanic, Black Panther. Now, knock on wood, hope that happens, right? But money talks, right? Like, oh, doing all of this stuff, being inclusive, writing all these characters in, making sure that the characters are more sensitive, giving the big, buff African guy a line like, I'm not gonna eat you, I'm a vegetarian. Like, doing little things like that to undercut certain stereotypes. If it's the number 3 or number 4, number 5 movie of all time, then it's going to happen, right? Jordan Peele signed a 5-picture deal. He also signed a deal with Netflix. Like, how many Jordan Peeles are there, right? But the reason he signed both these things is because they're like, oh my God, get out. Here's all the money, right? And so for me, it's important that Ava DuVernay's film is on track to have a huge opening, right? Because then she's gonna get the bag, right? Ryan Coogler, people are like, oh, Ryan Coogler can do whatever he wants now, right? Malcolm Lee, who's not an auteur in the way that these other directors are, but Malcolm Lee's Girls Trip, made a ton of money, so now he's getting a bag, right? Like, here you go, here's all the money you want for whatever comedy you want to do, right? And so, it sucks living in a capitalist society in a lot of ways, but in this element, it's going to work out. Hi, Nan, do you have a question for me?
Here, just take it.
Well, I haven't read any of the comics, but I was just curious of how the Ta-Nehisi's comics compared to the older ones, like in terms of race and politics.
Ta-Nehisi's clearly superior. No, I'm just playing with you. My favorite Black Panther is Reggie Hudlin's Black Panther. I'm gonna put my cards on the table. I love what Ta-Nehisi's doing, and I see a lot of value with what he's doing. But if I had to hand someone one thing and say, okay, here's the thing that gets you started, it would be the Reginald Hudlin, John Romita Jr., the first 6 issues of Black Panther. That run is, I just love it, right? But that's personal. Right, I come to it with a lot of history. Right, there are a lot of people for whom, and this is for me very gratifying to see. There are a lot of people who are experiencing, like the young lady here, who are experiencing Black Panther the way that I experienced Star Wars. Right, I had no context. I saw Star Wars, I was like, oh my God, right? It's like, and little geek was born, right? And so, but that's really, really important, right? And so yeah, so I think that all of the Black Panther, they're all necessary, even the ones that suck, which is why I spent some time on the one that failed, because it's the failures that allow you to say, oh, that was terrible, we have to fix that, we have to do better, right? I hope that there's been so much clamoring, not necessarily for Black representation, because Marvel's done a pretty good job. We have a Black Nick Fury, we have the Falcon, we have War Machine, that's Don Cheadle's character. There are Black people, there's Luke Cage, there's plenty of Black people, but there's been a lot of clamoring for Asian people in these movies, right? So it's like, hey,
and Latino
people as well. My bad, right? But so there's been and so again, it's hopefully one domino leads to other dominoes, right? But yeah, I think that just for turning the Dora, to tie these two things together, just for turning the Dora into what they have become in the cultural imagination, God, that's huge, right? It always baffles me when I'm on Twitter and people are like, Ta-Nehisi Coates is sexist because he never talks about, I'm like, you're reading Black Panther. Like, he's doing a lot for, for queer representation of women of color. Right, that wouldn't be in the film if it wasn't in his book, right? So it's important that we have to take the fullness of all of this stuff, the good and the bad. But if you want to get one, I'll text your dad. I'll tell you the one to get. Okay.
My question is for like a reiteration of how you explain the end of the film after the credits, that one scene.
Oh, the White Wolf scene?
Yeah, because I kind of didn't get it.
Okay, that's cool. So, one of the fun things about comics is, most comics, you don't need to know what the hell is going on in all the other comics to read a comic. So you can walk in and pick up an issue of Daredevil and read Daredevil, right? What you can't do is pick up an issue of the Avengers, because then you're going to be lost, because they're constantly throwing things in. The same thing, you can go in and pick up an issue of Wonder Woman, and it's a self-contained story about Wonder Woman. What you can't do is pick up an issue of Justice League, because then you're getting all the crazy narratives, right? So I thought this was the most successful Marvel movie since like the sort of the first run at being self-contained, right? So if you've never seen a Marvel film or you're not keeping careful track, you don't need any of that knowledge. You can just go in and just love everything, right? You know, and you can laugh at Shuri's jokes. But to answer your question, T'Challa is introduced in Captain America: Civil War. In that movie, the antagonist is a brainwashed soldier, right? So in the movie, if you're watching the movie, when Shuri says, "Oh, good, another broken white boy for me to fix," she is referencing the fact that at the end of Captain America: Civil War, that character, the character who in the movie is called the White Wolf, is sent to Wakanda for healing, right? And so the issue is he's literally a Manchurian candidate, where if you say the right 5 things to him, he becomes an unstoppable assassin, right? And so it's like, okay, this is bad. What can we do? Well, of course, we give him to the smartest person in the world. The smartest person in the world is a 17-year-old black girl. And so what the movie is telling us, you know, people like me, is if you remember that at the end of Captain America: Civil War, that character was taken to Wakanda, then we haven't forgotten about him. Here he is, and in fact, he's cured, right? The fact that these little children can play with him and tease him, you know, tells us that he's cured, right? And so it's in a lovely way, it's another sort of testimony to Shuri's genius, right? She doesn't just fix the broken back of the CIA agent, she also can sort of reprogram this person's mind and take him. And so he's gonna have an important role to play in the next movie, but again, you don't need any of that to enjoy this. And there will be a sequel, and Coogler has signed on to direct the sequel and to write the sequel. And I'm sure there won't be, you won't need all of that. You know, they'll do it the same way they did this one, right? You know, because why would you mess with success?
So I recently read an interview where Coogler was talking about his choice to not put the Infinity Stones into this movie, and it kind of like relates to the self-contained that you were talking about, and how he talked about it was very purposeful because he wanted the vibranium to be the center of it, and he wanted people to not get confused. But if you believe that in the sequel he's going to continue that sort of self-containment, what are your opinions on that? And like, because it is the MCU, so it kind of can't be self-contained, you know? No,
I know. So one of the things that's going to happen, and by the way, so whoever asked the next question, that will be the last question because we are running out of time. But to answer your question, and sorry, this is going to get like real geeky. Stop it. This is going to go another level. So the meteor that carries vibranium to Earth clearly has the soul gem inside of it. That's why when they eat the herb that has been mutated by the vibranium, they can enter into the afterlife. That's literally the power of the soul gem. If you look at
you are going deep, because I did not know this.
If you look at the trailer for the Infinity War, which will be out in like May or whatever, if you look at the trailer, there's, you know, the central scene is all the heroes are in Wakanda. Why are they in Wakanda? Well, we know where all the other Infinity Gems are. We don't know where the last one is. And what's the last one? It's the Soul Gem. And what can everyone do in Wakanda that you can't do anywhere else? You can go to heaven. I want to go to heaven and see my mom passed away. I want to see her, you know, but only in Wakanda can you do that. Well, why? Right? It's not because, you know, based on the logic of the universe, there's only one reason. One, for that to be a thing, and two, for the trailer to be set in Wakanda, where you see Ghidorah and Black Panther and M'Baku running with Iron Man and Winter Soldier, and you know they're all there because Thanos is there to get that Infinity Stone, right? So, in some ways, it's going to be impossible to write around that, but the assumption is going to be, well, y'all saw this, so y'all going to go see that too. right? And that's how these things sort of reinforce themselves, because all the people who are like, well, I didn't see any of the other ones, but I love Black Panther. Well, guess what? He's in this movie too. Go see that. And that's what Disney and Marvel and Ryan are, they're all betting on that, right? Okay, so last question. I can't, man. I know you. So it's gonna be in the back. Come on, man. I'm sorry, Ben. I love you.
Who that? Oh, wait, I didn't answer that. Okay. For most superhero movies, going into comics, there's usually a disconnect between how the comic is written, how the characters are depicted, versus how they are in the movies. For Black Panther, would you say that there's a wide disconnect for those who are not familiar with the comics? And like, how would that be resolved for people who aren't familiar with the way that the comics are versus what they saw in the movie?
Right. The comics, there is a disconnect, and the disconnect is because the books improve on many of the characters. So if you go back and you look at the original Killmonger, like, Jesus Christ, like, that dude was offensive as hell. And the Michael B. Jordan Killmonger is this incredible, richly textured character, right? If you go back and you look at the character M'Baku, M'Baku, for those who haven't read the comics, M'Baku's name in the comics, his name is Man-Ape. And he walks around with a big, giant albino ape hide draped over his body. And I was like, when I first heard that they had cast someone to play that character, I was like, what the hell is Ryan Coogler doing? Oh no. But then when he walked out in the Ascension scene and the chant and the mask and, we cannot have it. We cannot have, I'm like, oh my God, like they actually made it better, right? So whereas, like, if you look at Christopher Priest's run and you're like, wow, the Dora are these like sex pots, that's not how I remember them. Well, Ta-Nehisi fixed that, right? If you think about like this millennial history, that's not in the Christopher Priest run or the McGregor run, or that's what Reginald Hudlin, another filmmaker, he fixed that, right? So, but a lot of the characters are, Shuri, by the way, the scientist, Shuri is way more competent in the film than she is in the comics. She's always in her brother's shadow. Does that describe the character in the film? Not at all, right? No, yeah, this is what gets tricky, right? Because one of the things you've seen is that Steve Rogers looks more and more like Chris Evans, right? And no, seriously, like, if you go back and you look at Captain America from the 70s and 80s and 90s, and then you look at the recent Captain America, it's Chris Evans. They've taken pictures of him and put him into Photoshop, and and so this is the tension between the film and the comics, because you don't have as wide a palette to play with. Like, it's all sort of foreclosed because you've had these iconic performances, right? One of the things that jumped out to me was Chadwick's Widow's Peak, right? I'm like, man, every Black Panther from now on is going to have a Widow's Peak because Chad has a Widow's Peak, right? That's just how it goes. And so I think that you will see Shuri. It's already happening, right? There's I went on what's this thing called? Apple, the iTunes thing. It's like, download the new Black Panther mobile game. I was like, oh, let me click on this. And you can play as 3 characters, and the third character is Shuri. And I watched a little demo, she's kicking out. I'm like, wow, Shuri is, that's not the Shuri of the comics. That's the movie Shuri who's there, being awesome, right? So I think that, the synergies are going to be interesting to watch moving forward. So, thank you, everyone.